Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the session number 4 of the Model Developmental Psychology 2. As you remember, we are talking about adolescence. We started talking about physical development, namely puberty. Then we talked about cognitive development, and today we'll start talking about psychosocial development of adolescence. Talking about psychosocial development of adolescence, there are two important topics to take into consideration: moral development and self-identity. I will start with the list of vocabulary, as I told you, and I will make an effort to send you this every week from now as agreed. So, about moral development, we have the perspective of two authors, the perspective of Piaget and the perspective from Kohlberg. First of all, let's understand what is moral. Moral is related to a system of values and principles related to a culture that help us to define what is right and what is wrong. So this ability for us to make judgments and to decide what is acceptable and not acceptable is moral. And we will start with the perspective of Piaget. And for that, I have this first question for you to make. Please try to answer to this question. Piaget made his theory from this book, Le Jugement Moral chez l'Enfant, already in 1932. He told on these two main ideas. First, that the respect of each person by social rules through a sense of justice is one of the main aspects of morality. He also thought that moral development proceeds through stages the same way as the cognitive development stages. And he defined two main types of morality: heteronymous and autonomous morality. And from the theory of Piaget, I just want you to know clearly the difference between these two concepts. Of course, as you can imagine, it's a bit more complex than this, but I just want you to understand the difference between heteronymous morality and autonomous morality. Well, heteronymous morality means that the moral is outside of the individual. So for the child in this stage, moral is outside. There is a figure of authority that defines what is wrong and what is right. And because of that, this is sacred and intangible. We cannot discuss this morality because someone defined that for me. And for children, this morality is related to the consequences of the action. If what we are doing has consequences, that will make negative consequences. I mean, that will make something being bad. And based on that, morality is also objective and quantifiable. This means that it's possible to measure the severity of an action based in objective things. So if the damage is huge, so the thing that we did is worse. And because of that, when people are not committed with the rules, it should require punishment. So when a behavior is good, doesn't require punishment, and if something is not good or appropriate or related to the rules, should be punished, the behavior. So the main idea, heteronymous. Heteronymous means outside the person, and the consequences of the action are what defines if a behavior is moral or not. Piaget also talks about autonomous moral stage. Autonomous already in this case means that the morality is inside the individual. The individual, the person, and this will appear in adolescence, the person will internalize the values, the rules, and will understand that this is not related only with the consequences, but also, and this is very, very important, is related with to the motives, intentions, and circumstances. So the thing is not good or bad because of the consequences of my action, but my intentions, why I wanted to do that, and the circumstances that were related to this. That's why the sanctions, when something is wrong, the sanctions are not based on punishment, but are related to the specific situation, namely to repair what was wrong related to this. So the idea is not to punish the person, but to repair the negative consequences of our action. So I would like you to think about the answers of that you did for that dilemma about the dishes, and I would like you to think about the stage of your answers. And here I have two examples. A child in the heteronymous moral stage would say that the first boy made worse because he broke 12 dishes. It is worse because he broke a lot of dishes. However, someone in the autonomous moral would say the opposite. The second boy made worse because the first one had a good intention. He wanted to help the mother, and because of that, that is not that bad. So on Monday, let's discuss about this and to see what you replied. And I would like also to discuss with you this other example. Here we have the answer, but first I would like you to try to answer by yourself. As I told you, these types of morality are also related to the types of sanctions. If we have someone in the heteronymous stage, that person will prefer or will understand better expiatory penalties like punishment or consequences directly to the individual. And if someone is in the stage of autonomous morality, penalties for reciprocity will make more sense. That means to repair something bad that happens. Here we have a better explanation of what is expiatory penalties, in which the goal is to make people to obey based on the power of the person who has the right to impose the rules. And we have the penalties for reciprocity based on the relationship between the nature of the thing that has been done and the punishment. This should be proportional and should be related to what happened. For instance, here we have the example to repair what was spoiled by the action of the child. There are different factors affecting the moral development, and here are the main factors: cognitive development, contact with adults, contact with peers, and of course, all the other dimensions of the environment as explained by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. So the moral development that each person has follows these stages, but is also affected by the experiences that we have in our life and the contact that we have with the others. The others are all really important for us to develop our moral system. Now that we finish the perspective of Piaget, and let me tell you again, this is much more complex, but for me, I just want you to keep these two ideas. I would like to introduce you the perspective of another author who studied a lot about moral development. And this gentleman is named Lawrence Kohlberg. Usually we talk about the Kohlberg stages of moral development. And about this system, I would like you to know a bit more. Kohlberg made his theory of stages of moral development based on the ethical principle of justice, thinking that justice is the basis of any moral system and that morality is a kind of contract, social contract that people makes among themselves in order to create social norms and rules for us to live in society. In order to understand his theory uh, and to understand the moral judgment of different people, Kohlberg defined a series of dilemmas and asked people to answer to these dilemmas. This dilemma from Heinz is one of the most famous of dilemmas that he used to ask his participants to understand their moral development. That's why I also would like you to do this. Please read this dilemma of Heinz and then try to answer to these 5 questions about the situation that was described. So, what are the main ideas of the Kohlberg stages of moral development? He defined 3 different levels or 3 different stages of moral reasoning. Each of these stages divided in 2 substages. And it has this principle that each new stage replaces the previous one. And finally, I would like you to understand really well this. When we talk about the stages of moral development in Kohlberg, the main idea is not exactly in which stage the person is. The idea is more what kind of moral judgment the person is capable to do. This means that in order you will see that we have 6 substages or 6 levels, but the person can be able to take actions in stage 5, but that doesn't mean that in different situations or circumstances that person will not decide to have actions based on stage 1 or stage 2. What doesn't happen is the opposite. Someone who only is able to do actions on stage 3 is not expected to make actions based on stage 5. So when you can reach a higher level of morality, that doesn't mean that sometimes we don't have behaviors related to lower levels of morality. And I think that you will understand that with examples that I will show you. So, and these are the 3 stages and substages. It's more or less easy to understand and to memorize the 3 stages. We have the conventional morality, the level 2. And when we talk about conventions, to be easier for you, you can think as convention about law or rules. So the conventional morality is when the child or adolescent is aware of the existence of conventions or existence of laws or rules. The level 1 is pre-conventional. That means that is a stage of moral development in which the child is not aware or doesn't understand the existence of these laws. And then we have the post-conventional morality, that is after the laws. So in this stage, the person understands the existence of laws, but that is something more than that. So it's easy for you to understand the conventional, the before the conventional, the conventions, and the after the conventions. Each of these levels, as I told you, is divided into substages, and in total we have 6 stages for moral development defined by Kohlberg. So the first level, pre-conventional, it's easier to understand. In the first moment of our life, the stage 1 is called obedience and punishment orientation. Basically, the idea is that we do or don't do the things in order to avoid to be punished. So if I will not be caught and no one discovers what I did, I will not be punished, and I didn't do anything wrong. This is the typical example of put the things under the carpet. So if no one will see, there's no problem. So the idea is always, if I do the things, is to avoid to be punished. A typical example of one behavior of adults related to this is when we are driving and we are talking in the mobile. And suddenly we see the policeman there and we throw the mobile because we don't want to be caught by the policeman to be punished. This is a behavior that an adult of level 5 of morality can do anytime. That means that if I'm not talking in the mobile, is only because I don't want to be punished. So for the child, this stage, the convention or the law is not that important. What is important is that I will not be caught. The stage 2, still pre-conventional, is what is called individualism and exchange or interest. So the idea here is if I do something good or bad, is because I have interest, is because I expect some benefit or some of my desires or needs to be satisfied. So the idea is I do this because I want my mother to give me a sweet or to give me a compliment. So the idea is I'm not aware of the law, but I'm aware that if I do something in a specific way, I will have benefits. That's why I do that. So this is the stage 2 of morality. In the level 2, conventional morality, we have two stages, stage 3 and stage 4. So in this stage, the child or adolescent is aware of the existence of laws. Now, we know that the laws need for something. In stage 3, that is called good interpersonal relationships, the laws exist in the mind of the child or adolescent because I want to be a good boy, a good citizen, or a good friend, or a good husband if I'm already a grown-up. So the idea is there are laws, I should follow the laws to be a good person and to have good relationships with the others. So I'm aware that it exists, but indeed I don't understand exactly why, but I know that for me to be a good citizen, I should follow these laws. And this is the stage 3 defined by Kohlberg. In stage 4, maintaining the social order, we have a slight different thing. I know now that there are laws, but more than that, more than just to be a good citizen, I completely understand why it is important to obey to specific laws. For instance, what I have here, I should not park my car close to the crossing of pedestrians, not just because it is forbidden, but because it might put the pedestrians in danger and will not allow them to cross in safety. So we know that there are laws that we should obey, and that is to keep the social order, and that there is a reason for that. And this is the stage 4. So, as you can see, in this level of conventional morality, the law or the rule or convention is the most important aspect. Finally, level 3, post-conventional morality. In this level, we assume that the laws are important, and I want you to pay attention to this. In this stage, children or adults or adolescents continue to accept that the laws are important. However, now we know that there are something more than the laws. That's why this stage usually appears by adolescence, because now we are capable of abstract reasoning. Now, in this stage, people know that there are individual rights People know that are moral values and principles that are in the basis of the law. So I can assume that the laws are important, but I can be a bit flexible, taking into account the circumstances of what is happening. That's why some people also calls this stage as relativism of law. So the law is not something strict and rigid, but is something that can be relative and can be flexible according to the circumstances of the situation. And I think that the discussion that we'll have about the Heinz dilemma will show us exactly this. Finally, we have Kohlberg defined stage 6 universal principles, but indeed we can say that this is a utopic stage because this will not happen, at least in the next centuries in our society. A moment in which human rights, justice, and equality is fully reached and everybody acts according to this universal principle of fairness. Well, he assumed that this will not happen. So we can assume that most of people, adults, will stay in stage 5. But um, let's see your answers to the Heinz dilemma and to talk a little bit about that. I also made a small research about morality and moral development in Chinese adolescents. And there is some ideas that I would like to highlight. First, as you all know, the importance of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism in all the moral system of adolescence. Another aspect is the self-effacement and modesty. This idea that I should not to expose myself, that I'm not in the first place, that the group is more important than the individual. And then there are some values very present still in Chinese culture, like maintenance of harmony, obedience, and filial piety. This idea that is expressed in this picture, in which the young people pay respect to the elderly, is still something that is very profound in the moral system of Chinese adolescents. A study made in it's really interesting that studies made in China showed, and this paper is really interesting, showed the importance of Kohlberg stage 3 for Chinese. Do you remember that stage 3 is that one of the importance of being a good person, a good citizen? So the studies are showing that Chinese children, they act mostly in order to be nice boys or nice girls. I found also a very interesting study. I will not make you questions about this, but it's really interesting. A study from 1942 about the vices and ideals of Chinese adolescents. And it's really interesting because they made a list of ideals or virtues in adolescence and a list of vices. And you see, in 1942, dancing was considered a bad thing for adolescents in China. Well, good that I was not born in China that time because I love to dance. And they made a study showing what for men, women, boys and girls and mix, what are the most important vices. In this case, as you can see, snobbishness and cheating and sex irregularity were the most important, and also which are the most important virtues. And we had honesty and courage here in the first place. Uh, More other studies using the defining issues test. This defining issues test is a instrument to measure the stages of moral development based on the theory of Kohlberg, and studies made with Chinese adolescents showed that also in Chinese adolescents there is support for the stages of Kohlberg. So even in Chinese adolescents, we can identify these same stages. And studies made in Hong Kong found that there are no differences in morality between boys and girls. What we were talking up to now was about moral judgment or moral reasoning. But I also like to introduce another concept, that is the concept of moral orientation. This is the measure in which way adolescent or a person uses moral values in their actions. So I can be able to make good moral judgments, but if I will be orientated by morality to take my actions is a completely different thing. And there are interesting studies about this. As you can see, we can divide the people who have moral values as based on their actions as considered the altruist people, and those with low moral orientation, we can say that they are the egoists because they put themselves always in the first place. There are different studies, and I found this very interesting study of Ma 2003 about moral orientation and moral judgment in Chinese students and how it is related to prosocial and antisocial behaviors. And as you can imagine, those adolescents, boys or girls, with higher levels of moral judgment and moral orientation, they also have higher levels of prosocial behavior and lower levels of antisocial behavior. The studies also found that usually Chinese girls have higher moral orientation than boys. That means that even though boys are also able to make good moral judgments, the girls use more these moral judgments in their actions. Well, maybe that's also why boys have higher levels of delinquent behavior than girls. I'm talking about another very interesting study about cultural differences in morality between Chinese adolescents and adolescents from the United States. And it's really, really interesting because in general, Chinese adolescents, they consider good moral character, morality, more important than do US adolescents from the United States. But when we look to the questionable online behaviors, it seems that Chinese adolescents online, they accept better that these questionable behaviors will be accepted. So it seems that when they are more in private and no external authority, Chinese adolescents online, they tend to accept more behaviors that can be questionable. So I finished this topic of morality to highlight the importance of studying moral development. Indeed, it's a topic that is particularly important in China, and even nowadays, that the Macau government is studying or is preparing new guidelines for youth for the future, in which this idea of civic education is very important. It will be really interesting that in the future we continue to make more studies about moral beliefs and moral development of Chinese adolescents, but specifically also Adolescence in Macau. Finally, I also would like to introduce another topic. It's something that we already talked last year, uh, but that will have important developments now in adolescence. It's about self and identity. Last year I introduced the topic of self. I think that you remember that when we talk about self is when we put ourselves as objects of our own observation. Is when I think and create opinions about me. And last year I showed this and explained you the difference between these concepts: self-image, self-concept, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. Uh, Last year I also introduced you an instrument for evaluation of self-esteem in children, and the same instrument, and I think that later you'll talk about this with Professor Edlia when in the class about psychological evaluation. I also would like to introduce you a very interesting instrument from Susan Harter to evaluate self-perception or self-esteem in adolescence. You have here an instrument, and if you are doing your work, final report with an adolescent, you can use this scale from Susan Harter that will define scores of self-esteem in these different domains and also a global score of self-worth. What happens in the development of self through adolescence? Well, you could see that in middle childhood, children start to compare themselves with peers, and you also aware that they start to be more aware of their strengths and weaknesses. That's why they could start to describe themselves in terms of physical characteristics, but also in terms of psychological, also in psychological terms. In early adolescence, when adolescence will start, the social comparisons will increase a lot. Adolescents start to look more to the others and to compare. And as we told when we talk about puberty, comparing themselves with the others is specifically important for girls. And that's why the self-esteem in girls usually decreases a lot during early adolescence. And what also happens is that adolescents, they start to believe in the imaginary audience. What this means, the idea that people are looking at me, that people are making judgments about myself, and based on that, they create their own fantasies or fables or stories about what others are planning or thinking about me, and they truly believe about that. In late adolescence, the uh, the important step that is also related to an increase of self-esteem, and this is really a very important step, is that we start to develop a more complex understanding of ourselves, accepting contradictory descriptions. This is very important in late adolescence. For us to be in peace with ourselves, we need to accept that there are some characteristics on us that are not that good. We also have limitations, and we need to learn how to deal with that, and it's okay to be me the same. So to accept contradictory descriptions about myself is very important in late adolescence, and my identity will start to develop over time during adolescence. And when we talk about identity, we need to go back to Erik Erikson. Indeed, Erikson was the first person to talk about this concept of identity. So, as you remember, Erikson made a series of stages, a theory with stages of psychosocial development. He highlighted the importance of the crisis and that it was a real resolution of crises that make us grow up in terms of psychosocial development. I think that you remember, and I will ask you to revise the different stages of psychosocial development defined by Erikson. And the first one, trust versus mistrust. Second, autonomy, shame versus shame and doubt. Third, initiative versus guilt. Fourth, industry versus inferiority in childhood, when children will go to school and they are facing school demands and evaluation. And finally, in adolescence, and this is the first time that the word identity started to be used systematically in psychology, we have the stage 5 that was called by Erikson as identity versus role confusion. So the most important task of adolescents in terms of psychosocial development is to be clear about their own identity. What are they? So the question that adolescents have in this stage is very existential. It is, who am I and what can I be? As I already explained, that's also why this is called a very long transitional stage. Now I can be aware of what happened in the past in my life. I will make a synthesis in the present about what am I, but because I have this thing of temporal perspective of future that I told you last class, I can start to anticipate and to think about what I will be in the future or what I can be in the future. So, and the construction of identity is made in this balance between the past and the future. And this is the most important task that adolescents have. So, when we talk about identity, this is related to the sense of what the person we are and is related to the information we have about ourselves. And self-identity is what I know and what I see and how I see myself. On the other hand, social identity are the characteristics that the others gave to me. But we are here talking about self-identity. What am I and is the information that I have? And when we talk about identity, indeed, we need to talk about multiple identities. There are different characteristics about ourselves, and we create different definitions depending on the context in which we found ourselves. And here we have many different aspects of our identity that can be really diverse. And all these questions are questions that the adolescents have to answer. What is my gender identity? I learned from the beginning that they are boys and girls, but now I'm really a boy, I'm a man. And about religious identity, my parents made me Catholic. I went to church every Sunday. I have to go to the mass. But now that I'm adolescent and I can create other possibilities, I can see that there are other religions. There are many other possibilities. I am really a Catholic person, or I can be another thing. So this kind of construction of myself, building my identity, answering these questions, because now we have more possibilities, or we are aware that there are more possibilities, is a very important task in adolescence. And indeed, identity is related to autonomy, to the ability that we have to participate in the decisions about our life, or on building ourselves as persons. And identity is also related to individuation, is to identify what makes me special and unique. I know that I have things that are similar to others. I know that it's important to belong to something, but identity is also about identify what is specific about me and what makes me being different from the others. And when I'm talking about being different from the others, this also means being different from my parents, being different from my family. I know that I belong to a family. I know that my parents, they gave me moral values, principles, and expectations of what they were expecting from me. But to develop an identity is also to find what is only mine, what I created different from the others, including my parents and my uh, all the rest of my family. And of course, that as you can imagine, these have impact in the family functioning. And the more open to emotional expression and more supportive the parents will be at this level, the more positive will be the outcomes in the adolescence, but also in the relationship with in the family. Finally, when we talk about identity, we also need to talk about identity statuses. And when we talk about this concept of the statuses of identity, there is one very important author that we should take into consideration, which is James Marcia. James Marcia did a very interesting theory explaining 4 types of identity statuses. It's a bit complex, but I want you to know the most important ideas. But for that, please answer to these 2 simple questions in your Google Classroom exercise. The theory of James Marcia is based in these 2 factors or 2 dimensions, crisis and commitment. Uh, Crisis means to be in a period of engage in choosing among different alternatives. And commitment is when we have a degree of personal investment in something that we chose. And this balance between a crisis and a commitment can be applied to many different dimensions of identity according to this table. And here in this table, we have the 4 identity statuses. What we are expecting, all of us, is to reach a stage of identity achievement. But indeed, this is the final step that we all want to achieve, to be full of myself, to know who I am, and to know that what I am, it is what I decided to be. But that was not always like this. Most of the time, and usually until adolescence, for James Marcia, we are in a stage of foreclosure. What this means? This means that I never experienced a crisis. So I was always committed. See, yes, with commitment, no, with crisis. I was always committed with what my parents and my family decided for me. I want you to be a good student. I want you to play piano. I want you to be a good boy. I never questioned this. So I let the others, namely my mother and my father, to decide what I should be. And this is okay. I was committed with that. However, if I will continue all my life like this, I will never achieve my identity. What is expected to happen at some point of my life is to do what James Marcia calls moratorium. Moratorium is a moment in which there is a crisis and in which there is no any commitment. So moratorium for James Marcia and in many Western countries is something that usually happens in adolescence. Because now the adolescents can create different possibilities, can understand that I could be different. Why I have to be Catholic? Let me bring again this example. I could be Muslim. I have a friend that is Jewish. Now that I came to Macau, I understood Buddhism. So why I have to be a Catholic? And I start to question, to have doubts about what the others define it for me. And this is a moment of crisis. It's not a existential crisis of suffering, but it's a crisis of my convictions and a crisis of what other people define for me. And the most important ideas here is that this happens because now I can generate other possibilities. And I start questioning. As you can imagine, this moratorium in adolescence can be a reason for conflict, but does not have to be. Just because I'm questioning, that doesn't mean that I'm against. I'm just trying to understand other possibilities. That's why this is very, very important for identity achievement. So theoretically, we start from here, we come here, and after generating different possibilities in moratorium, we make some decisions, we make choices, and then we are committed with our choices. And is when we question, and after we make choices and we are committed to those choices, that we can reach identity achievement. But this doesn't mean that I need to be against my parents or against my family. I will give again my example related to this topic of religion. My parents are Catholic, and indeed they sent me to the catechesis to have all this training about Jesus Christ and all these things. And I went to the Mass every Sunday, and I did all the steps of Catholic education. But indeed, at some point of my life, it was not in adolescence, it was later, already when I left home, because indeed I was not able to dispute and to question these religious things with my parents while I was living with them. So I waited to leave home and I start to question. And indeed, the fact that I had friends from other religions helped me to think about this in a different way. So at some point I decided, no, I don't know if I'm Catholic or not. Let me think about this. At the end, I decided, yes, I am Catholic and I will continue to be Catholic. It makes sense for me. So the final result is exactly the same. Before the moratorium, I was Catholic. After the moratorium, I continue to be Catholic. What is the difference here? The difference is that I was able to question. And when I was able to question, the fact of being Catholic became my own decision. I continue to be Catholic, but now it's because I decided that I want to be Catholic. You understand? That's why moratorium is really important for identity achievement. Even though I continue with the same thing, I need to question. So I know that what I am is what I decided to be. I have to tell you that what I already read about this in Chinese people is that most of the time Chinese people, they postpone the moratorium to university time or even when they start work and leave home. Usually exactly in order to avoid conflict and to keep harmony in the family, adolescents, they are taught to hide their desires, to hide and not to question. And indeed, this is something that we can talk and discuss a little bit. When someone simply doesn't have any commitment with values and principles and anything, and never had a crisis about anything, we call it identity diffusion. This is related to someone who never is just there. So here are some examples of answers to these questions that I ask you to reply related to the different statuses of identity. And we will discuss about this on Monday. With this, I conclude my class. Thank you for your attention and have a nice rest of weekend and see you soon, my dear students. Bye-bye.